Good afternoon, everybody. That was actually one of the first times someone's gotten my name correct. I get a lot of Alicia, so thank you. I used to live in Boston. I actually recently moved to San Francisco, so very, very different part of the country. You can find me on Twitter at AliciaBility. I'm a lead front-end engineer at a startup called Third Channel back in Boston. We do retail data analytics. And I tweet a lot about accessibility and front-end testing, which is usually something I talk about, and if you will be at Frontiers later in a few weeks, I'm actually speaking about front-end testing there. But I am not talking about code whatsoever today. We're going to talk about burnout this afternoon, which is, it's a little bit of a grim topic, but you know, very, very important these days, especially in our industry. If you go to Wikipedia, which is everyone's favorite research, website, you will see this definition for burnout. It's a type of psychological stress that is characterized by exhaustion, lack of enthusiasm, no motivation, and feelings of ineffectiveness, often resulting in cynicism and efficacy within our workplaces. And that's all fine and dandy, but definitions are a little bit boring, and so I'd rather illustrate this with a personal story 3 or 4 years ago when I experienced burnout firsthand. So the situation was that I was finally a lead on my first project, and I was consulting. And there were a lot of very interesting factors at play. I was learning a new technology for this project. I was the only woman on a team at my company and with our client, and the rest of everyone was like very kind of dominant alpha male type of personality. And there wasn't really any support for me for kind of dealing with the conflicts that would arise with this client in particular. And without that feedback, I started to, get into my own head a bit and start to think about, well, am I doing what's right? I used to be excited about this project. How come I'm not so excited about it anymore? And along with this kind of came this feeling of needing to really prove myself to this client, to my own company, I guess partially to myself. The project itself was on an extremely tight deadline, and we were working very, very late into the night for several weeks at a time. And eventually, this combination of things led me to just straight up stop caring about doing good work, about what I was, producing from a technical perspective. And after, this 3-month project that we were on, 3 months into it, I was working late one night. It was about 10 o'clock p.m. And just kind of randomly, I had a nervous breakdown in my own apartment. And that's when I sort of realized that, hey, maybe things aren't going so great. And I kind of didn't really know what was going on at the time. I didn't understand why it was affecting me so much, because I didn't really understand what burnout was at the time. Burnout plays out a lot differently depending on who you talk to. My story is one side of things. Other people, much like how they deal with stress differently, may show different signs of burnout themselves. And so the kind of big caveat for this talk today is that this is not just one set way of dealing with burnout, of identifying it. There are lots of different factors at play, but hopefully this gives everyone a very good baseline of what to look for and what we're talking about when we talk about burnout in the workplace. From my personal experience and from talking to other people in the industry who have experienced different levels of burnout, a lot of what comes into factor is this concept of burnout versus technical growth. That even when we are exhausted from our day jobs, we still feel this inherent pressure to keep growing on our personal time or by working late for our employers. And it's very much this weird battle of what's expected of developers these days versus what are the realities of the lives that we lead. When we talk about technical growth, a lot of people say, well, if you want to learn something, you should do a side project. And people assume that we have the time to do these side projects. It assumes that someone doesn't have other things that they need to take care of in order to work on their own personal growth all the time on their own time. And a lot of what happens is that we also assume that if someone is exhausted from, trying to grow on their own time, that they would speak up about it, like very plainly, and say, hey, I am exhausted by this thing. Which isn't always necessarily the case. As humans, we do not have infinite time on this planet for our jobs, and we have other things going on. Someone might not be able to do a side project because they have kids that they take care of at home, or simply they have other interests besides coding every single hour of the day. And when we talk about asking people to learn on their personal time or to dedicate themselves, 100% of the time to, their careers, sometimes that comes in the form of unpaid labor. So for example, if I need to learn a new technology because it's required for work, but work does not allow me the time to learn this on their time, like during my work hours, they're expecting me to essentially work extra in the evenings, early mornings, other times that are not part of my salaried time frame. And there's another weird thing that I've noticed through my career is that we have this issue with ageism in tech where the older a person gets, the harder it is a lot of the times nowadays to find jobs in particular areas of technology. And because we're kind of pushing people to learn so much very quickly, and so they end up just being totally exhausted from having to learn all the time. There is a concept of I believe it's 10,000 hours of doing something before you're officially an expert at it. And when you combine that with the fact that a lot of companies are looking for people who are experts but are still within this young 20s kind of mentality, you don't have time to hit that 10,000 hours in a maintained way. You have to learn very quickly. So there's a lot at play, at least from my experience, and perhaps it's different, worldwide, but yeah, just from being at other conferences and talking about this with a lot of people, these are a lot of the themes that consistently come up. So in order to start addressing burnout, I really want to start with a clear baseline of what are we actually talking about. And there was a study done back in 2006 by two psychologists who theorized that the burnout process can be divided into 12 parts that aren't necessarily followed sequentially, but when someone talks about burnout, these 12 pieces usually are there. And it usually starts with a compulsion to prove someone or prove themselves to, either their own internal kind of boss or their, actual work boss. They're trying to exhibit excessive ambition toward a goal, and it gets extremely compulsive. After this, someone might begin working harder, which isn't always a bad thing on its own. But they start doing it because they feel that this helps them prove themselves to these outside forces, and end up establishing extremely high personal expectations that might not have come from outside people. In order to meet these expectations, they tend to solely focus on work, and they will start to habitually take on more work than they would otherwise in different situations. And it may happen that they kind of do it to show that they are irreplaceable within their teams and their situation. This then develops into starting to neglect their own personal needs. Because they're devoting everything to work and they're working harder and they have set these incredibly high expectations for themselves, they are running out of time and they're running out of energy for things like friends and family, for eating and sleeping, because they see it as unnecessary or unimportant. Because if you're not working, then what are you actually doing? And this gets reinforced by, I think, certain conversations that happen kind of within our ecosystem. Eventually, they start to displace conflicts. So essentially what this is that they realize there's something wrong with their current situation, but they're not entirely able to pinpoint why. If someone's super overworked, they might not be able to say, like, hey, I know why I'm overworked and here are the reasons. They just know they are, but don't feel like there's anything they can necessarily do about it. And this is where the crisis sort of turning point starts to show itself within these stages of burnout. A person will then start to revise and reevaluate their own personal values. So while falling into a state of denial about their basic needs on an everyday basis, what they perceive as valuable is also going to evolve. Essentially, the priority of family and hobbies and other activities just completely drops off the map, even though those were things important to this person initially. Their current job becomes the new value system, and it's the only value that they will have. And they start to become emotionally blunt, and so you're not, engaging emotionally with friends and family like you used to, or colleagues. Everything is very starts to get a little bit robotic, and then they start to deny that anything is even wrong, and that this is kind of how the way things have always been. They may get overly aggressive and overly sarcastic. And they'll kind of put blame to outside time pressures and things like that, but refuse to see it as anything wrong with them on a personal level. A person will then start to withdraw. This is also where substance abuse might start coming into play. If someone's overly indulging in alcohol or drugs, and it's very uncharacteristic of them. This is also when people kind of feel pretty hopeless in their situations or don't really know what direction they should take, and they kind of start to cut themselves off from people. Eventually we get into obvious behavioral changes, and this is something that people who are close to this person just simply cannot deny, and they say, this is not how you usually behave, and we don't know why you are doing this. And it's not something that can necessarily be overlooked anymore. It's become affecting of everyone around this person. And then they become a bit depersonalized, so they no longer start to see themselves as valuable to other people. In contrast to how this process started, they wanted to prove that they were, important and irreplaceable to the people around them, and now at this point they have lost all any idea of their value. So it's quite the shift there, and they start to kind of get tunnel vision a little bit on how their lives are playing out, and essentially they see it just as a series of mechanical functions. So there's no way that you can have influence in it. It's just kind of this churn that you're forced to experience. Inner emptiness. overeating and again, overindulgence is now a very big part. Eventually, a person will begin to suffer from chronic depression. And finally, we get to burnout syndrome, which in and of itself is not just the emotional stuff that we've, that in these 11 other stages have been very obvious. This is also physical. So extreme exhaustion, panic attacks, nervous breakdowns. In extreme cases, people might become suicidal because they see it as the only way to get out of, this churn. And those are those 12 stages of what this actually is. So it's not just one thing. This is a series over, a distinctive period of time where these slowly start to essentially snowball into what we know as burnout. What's important to notice is that there's a difference between burnout and what is called brownout. And the big part of it is the lack of physical collapse that's not present in brownout, that is present in burnout. And so when someone suffers from brownout, they are experiencing that demotivation, that disengagement from their current work situation, but they're not experiencing the more kind of like compulsive physical displays of burnout. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because I think we throw the term burnout around a lot when that's not actually what it is. But burnout is a very great way to perhaps identify when someone is on their way to burnout. So not to absolutely, dismiss it by any means, but it's important to know that distinction. So how is this affecting our industry, our day-to-days, our career paths? It's kind of unfortunate because at this point I've worked in places that see it this way and, talked to a lot of other people who, see us doing this, but us as an industry kind of see burnout as this medal, this badge of honor, this kind of milestone of saying, I am in my career because I finally kind of got this exhausted, because it's happening often enough that it's starting to become normal. And, when people start to work late or, work on weekends, a lot of times that'll come out as they're dedicated to their work. They're really, they're in it for the team and things like that. They might be seen as a go-getter, or that they're super reliable in making sure things always get done, which in turn are things that a lot of us who are more in like a management type of position, look to when you're thinking about things like promotions and raises. And so it's reinforced that these habits of pushing yourself too far are then rewarded. And so we're kind of in this cycle that we can't break out of because of this kind of like positive feedback loop almost. And it's really unfortunate. So what can we actually do about this? And I want to compare kind of these next steps to, there's this game that perhaps you guys know about called Brains. So Trent Alton actually used this as an example at a talk at CSS-Tricks last year. And I really loved it, so I'm totally copying it. But this game called Brains is a game where you have 4 particular resources, and for every action you take, which is either kind of a yes or no, it's a very Tindery kind of like swipe left, swipe right kind of interaction. But for every action you take, a resource is increased or a resource is depleted. And so it's a constant balancing act of making sure you have enough resources essentially to run your kingdom. If you run out of money, kingdom's over. If you run out of people, you have no kingdom anymore. And I think it's a really good illustration of the trade-offs that we need to make as individuals, as people who run teams, about every decision that we're making that cause us to evaluate our personal resources and say, what can I give up? what can I gain? So there's a few things that we can do as individuals, which is usually where the conversation of burnout usually starts. What can we do personally to make sure that we don't burn out? Very often, saying no is kind of the first thing people will tell you. Starting to become a bit more firm about what responsibilities you do take on. Starting to push back when managers and other team members might start to expect too much of you. This is incredibly risky for some folks. They may not feel comfortable saying no to everything because they feel like they might have to accept these things and that there's not really a choice. Sometimes you have managers that really ask you a question expecting you to say yes, even though you might not want to. But if you have the ability to say no and set your boundaries, highly recommended. Making sure that on a daily basis, a monthly basis, you're kind of separating yourself a bit from your work and thinking about how am I feeling, just in like general. I've started to pay a lot of attention to mindfulness, which is not necessarily like I do this big evaluation of myself and try to figure out what I'm feeling and why, but it's more about feeling like, how am I? Am I like clenching my knuckles at work? Do I feel really tense? And just trying to pay attention to these little cues that might signal something bigger happening. It's not really about, trying to hide or, solve your feelings or anything like that, but acknowledging that they're there so that eventually you might be able to do something about them. I have found that trying to learn new technologies and just things in the tech world in moderation and not trying to like dive into it all at once has been extremely beneficial. Even if you're super duper excited about something, if you jump in headfirst too fast, that might not be all the time the best way to go about it. And setting kind of boundaries to step away, kind of internalize things so you're not just overloading yourself with information. The other part of this is that we get really excited when something brand new and shiny comes out and we feel like we need to learn it right then or else we're gonna fall behind everybody. And that's not necessarily the case, and so even if you do find these new things that you're like, oh, I really should learn this, you can hold off for a bit. It's probably not going anywhere. It'll be there like next week or next month more than likely. So don't feel like you have to do everything at once all the time. I've also found that rather than focusing on extremely niche topics, to learn things that can extend to other areas of what you're doing. For example, I like using the example of, are you specifically learning the ins and outs of a framework, or are you learning the ins and outs of the technology behind it? And I can focus entirely on the individual and what they can do, but that's usually where the conversation stops, and that's not entirely healthy. An individual is not 100% responsible for the burnout they kind of go through. It's as much the outside pressures from their jobs as well. And so as leaders, as managers, we have to